Welcome to the Army and Battle section of my Skaven guide. In this section we will be going over the entire Skaven roster and covering all the units' pros and cons, as well as compositions and formations for battle.
Rats, we're rats, we're the rats. We pray at night, we stalk at night, we're the rats.
Disclaimer, this guide is based on my personal experience and opinions and is by no means the definitive way to play the game in Mortal Empires. If you have a different strategy or want to add something to mine, please leave a comment down below. Now that's out of the way, let's get into the video.
As I said in the previous part of this guide, the Skaven really are focused on the endgame, and the unit roster is no different. Their early game units are basically all trash, which means you really need to make the most of the unique units your faction starts with and protect them at all costs, otherwise you'll be waiting a long time to replace them. Once you do get to the end game, they have quality war machines and artillery, and some of the best ranged units in the game for raw damage output. They also eventually get a couple of monster units, which are also pretty good for the most part when integrated into the melee lines. One thing that never leaves them, even in the end game, is the awful leadership. It does get slightly better and can be improved with Lord skills and unit XP, but for the most part, your units will still be retreating fairly often if they take too much damage. Fortunately, my strategy with them is centered around avoiding melee as much as possible, so it's not too much of a concern. One thing they do lack is any cav, and while they do have substitutes in the form of war machines, they don't have the same speed or charge impact as a line of horses with pointy sticks. With all that being said, let's get into the roster. Kicking us off with a bang are the Skaven Slaves, and wow, these guys are trash. They're an expendable meat shield whose sole purpose is to bog down enemy units to protect what's more valuable. They have pitiful stats, and even against zombies they'll only manage a handful of kills and will likely retreat before long due to the abysmal leadership. But you know what? That's just fine, because they do what they're supposed to do and are dirt cheap. Some lords even have skills that can make these guys even cheaper, so it's not a challenge to have nearly full army of these guys protecting your main forces. I take around 4 to 6 of these guys in the early game, and as I said, I use them as a shield to protect my real damage dealers. They come in 2 varieties, regular and spears. Spears of course offer a bonus versus large targets, but honestly it's not going to make a difference in practice, since if they're being charged they'll likely retreat before they get a hit in. And even if they do, it's not going to do much. Nevertheless, I take 4 regular slaves with 2 spear slaves just to have that mix in my melee lines. Next up in Clanrats, and these guys are also pretty trash, but marginally less trash than Skaven Slaves, to the point where they're actually your first viable front line. They're also classed as a meat shield and can be made expendable via research, but they're actually not too bad if you give them plenty of support. They aren't much to write home about in terms of damage output, but they are substantially better at holding a line than Skaven Slaves, and as such give your ranged units a lot more time to get into position and do all the damage. They're used in basically the same way as Skaven Slaves, but are slightly less of a hassle since they don't retreat as much. They also come in 4 varieties, regular, shields, spears and shields. As usual, spears get a little bonus versus large, but this time they also get charge defense versus large, so can actually take a charge and not immediately head for the hills. This also means they will be mildly okay at taking on some very early game large units in extended melee. But like usual, they will need support from higher damage units. Shields give both units some resistance to missile attacks, making them slightly more resilient and likely to stick around. They also change the stats very slightly, but it's not going to make that much difference in the long run, but nevertheless the difference in cost is so minor that I always take shields when I can, and my standard composition contains 4 regular shields and 2 spear shields. Wap Grinders are next, and they're a weird one. At a glance they're great, with very promising armor piercing damage, vanguard deployment and the ability to attack walls. They seem like a must have for any sieging army, but when I use them I just felt like they didn't have a place. They have pretty awful melee attack, meaning the damage output isn't actually that great, and their speed isn't the best, so the vanguard deployment didn't get used a colossal amount. One thing they do have that is very useful are the 2 abilities. One can force all enemy units to stop in an area, and one causes damage to all enemy units in that same area. This allowed them to halt cav charges and pin them down long enough to get your units in to surround them, or pick them off with ranged attacks. They also get a buff to their melee attack via the Forbidden Workshop and some research, which makes them pretty decent in extended melee, but other than that, they aren't the best, and they certainly aren't necessary, at least for me. When I did have them in my army, I only took about 2 to 4 of them at most, and they were gone by the end of the mid-game. Next up to bat are Triads, and they're honestly a strange addition to the roster. They're an anti-large unit that does AP damage with a Weeping Blade, but at the same time they have vanguard deployment and stalk. This means that their intended use is sneaking up on the enemy from a hidden deployment area, but since they're anti-large, they need to sneak up on cav and large units. They are quite fast, but nowhere near fast enough to catch up to cav, so it's kind of a struggle working out how to use them. I just ended up using them as my anti-large infantry, but their lack of armor made them get annihilated without support, so I ended up getting rid of them after a while of replacing them every other turn. It's worth knowing that if you're playing Clan Eshin, these guys will be stupidly cheaper than Storm Vermin, so they're probably a good choice there. When I did take them, it was only a couple of units in my army, and they replaced my Clan Rat Spears. Death Runners are next, and they're another unit that's focused on stalking around the map from a hidden location, but these guys aren't anti-large, and as such can go after units they can actually catch up to. They have Vanguard deployment and stalk, so can start off hidden and remain that way until they're right on top of the enemy, and at that point they can't do anything about it. They also have concealment bombs, so can just disappear as quickly as they appeared if they need to make a quick retreat. They also have Weeping Blades and dodge, so aren't anything to scoff at in melee, since they can do some pretty great damage whilst being able to avoid a lot of what's thrown at them. As I said before, the best way to use these guys is as a flanker from a hidden location, once the enemies commit to their attack and left a bunch of vulnerable units in the back. If they start to get overwhelmed or chased down, you can always use their concealment bombs to nope out of there whilst being unspottable. If I'm taking them, 2 of them are usually enough, as I need more of my army to be on the front lines than in the back of the enemy. Up next are Plague Monks. They're the anti-infantry powerhouse of the Skaven mid to endgame with outstanding damage and frenzy. They do lack AP, so may struggle against anything too tough, but against anything else they'll clean up nicely. Their bonus versus infantry and high weapon damage makes them chaff shredders, so they are amazing for sending against anything you don't want to waste your ammo on. They aren't the best at holding the line with their lower armour, so you want to make sure they're adequately supported so they don't break and expose the rest of your lines. They also come in 2 varieties, regular and sensor bearers. Sensor bearers are the way to go once you get them unlocked, as they're better in basically every way. Their plague sensors cause the contaminated effect, meaning anything they go up against will be breaking before long in sustained combat. They also have armour piercing damage, so can easily go against more elite units and take them out with ease. They still keep the frenzy ability too, so are even better at taking out enemies at the start of the fight, but at no point will they become bad at the job. I took 4 of these guys as soon as I could and replaced Clan Rats with Plague Monks and Plague Monks with Sensor Bearers as soon as possible. They come with me into the endgame, and every army that can have them does. Storm Vermin are our final units, and they also come in 2 varieties, Halberds and Sword and Shields. Sword and Shields do have the added benefit of being more protected from range attacks, but aside from that there's really no place for them in the roster in my opinion. They're a solid enough front line, and of course have more armour than Plague Monks, but their damage makes it a no contest for who I will take into the endgame. They can only really compete with regular Plague Monks, since they're also pretty good at taking out lots of chaff, but as far as high tier units go, they'll lose basically every battle they're in. Halberds are a different story entirely. They're the endgame anti-large units of the Skaven roster, and that spot is basically uncontested, so it's a no-brainer to take them with you. They're a great line holder, with their thick armour and ability to keep even the highest tier enemy infantry busy long enough to get your ranged units into position. Even if they aren't going against cav, they can still be extremely hard to take out and will often win against anything but the toughest enemy units. When they do go against large units, they can do some crazy damage and are a nightmare for cav, especially if they can get them pinned down. They also do alright damage against some huge units like the slower lizardmen monsters, but they will still need support and can't really go one-on-one. I take 2 of these guys into the endgame with me, but as far as swords and shields are concerned, I can only recommend them if you can't get your hands on Plague Monks. Our first ranged unit is the Skaven Slave Slingers, and as with the melee slaves, these guys are seriously underwhelming, but they are dirt cheap. They keep the expendable meat shield with low leadership attributes, but they do gain access to some decently ranged but indecently damaging slingers. They will run off at the first whiff of combat, so it's best to keep them well back from the enemy lines unless you want them to cheese it before they've even loosed off a volley. Of course you want to follow the usual strategy for ranged units of placing them up front before moving them back once the melee lines close in. After this you want to get an angle on the melee lines to make sure you're doing as much damage to the enemy units as possible and as little to your own units as possible. As I said before, this damage isn't going to be anything to write home about, but it is more than having no ranged units, and these guys are cheap as chips, so it isn't like a huge drain on your economy to have them in your roster. When I took them, I have about 3 to 6 of them, alongside a similar number of melee units, so that there was some form of battle lines in my super early game armies. Night Runners are the next step up, and quite a step it is. These guys do actual decent damage from a range and can fire whilst moving, which makes them a great early game skirmishing force. They also come with Vanguard deployment, so can get right up in the enemy faces before they even get close to attacking you in melee. Even if they do get caught, they're actually not too bad in melee against anything that isn't too tough. Plus they have dodge, so even if they can't deal out a ton of damage, they sure do know how to avoid taking much. Unfortunately, since they're a skirmishing unit, they don't have the greatest range in the world, so I wouldn't recommend taking them as your sole ranged force. Fortunately, they come in 2 varieties, regular and slings. Choosing slings grants them increased range at the cost of not being able to fire whilst moving, but aside from that, they're basically the same. Of course, since slings are more of a stationary unit, it's best to employ the usual range strategy here that I must have mentioned hundreds of times already in these guides, so you get the idea. I choose to take a mix of 3 of each of these guys, so I have a nice mix of units with different use cases on the field. Poisonwing Globadiers are our next range units, and these guys are actually where it starts to get pretty good. They fire poison wind globes which cause damage over time on top of their impact and explosion damage, which is also pretty top tier. Did I mention that these missiles are also armor piercing, so it doesn't matter who you're throwing these bad boys at, they're going to do some serious damage? The Globadiers themselves are also armoured, so if they find themselves getting the attention of enemy ranged units or some light melee action, they can last for a little while and give you enough time to bring in some support. They don't really do much in melee themselves, however, so don't expect to send them into melee anytime soon. Now, since I played as Clan Scryer and had access to Rattling Guns and Giselles quite early, I didn't actually use these guys much, but for any other clan, I'd say they're actually a really great upgrade from Gutter Runner Slingers and can probably last you a really long time without requiring an urgent upgrade. Though one upgrade that is totally worth it for these guys is their other variant, the Deathglobe Bombardiers. These guys have everything you love from the regular Bombardiers and add even more damage with the added bonus of magical damage, meaning that if the enemy has a ton of armor and physical resist, they won't be able to get away with it without taking some serious hits to their HP pool. I'd say for both of these guys it's best to take 2 or 3 of them to make sure you have some variety to the type of damage that is going out, and so you can get some units that aren't going to blow up your men once melee begins. Next up we have Warp Fire Throwers. If you ever wondered what it would look like if a giant rat got into the napalm storage, then here it is. These guys rain burning warp fire down onto the enemy, and this stuff completely melts anything that it comes into contact with. Not only does it do anti-infantry damage by the boatload, but it also applies the burnt effect on any units hit, meaning they will be running for the hills before long under the pressure. They're also armoured, so like Globadiers can take a bit of punishment before they start to make a run for it. But also like the Globadiers, it's best not to leave them in melee if you can help it and get them some support as soon as possible. They also follow the usual strat of ranged units, and since they do fire in quite a shallow arc, they will need to get a good angle on enemy units to ensure there isn't too much friendly fire. As I said before, they are more infantry focused, but if they need to, they can also do some great damage to single entity targets, and all they'll miss out on is the bonus versus infantry. I'd say taking 3 of these guys along with 3 Globadiers would make for an excellent mid-game backline. Gutter Runners are next, and they're essentially the direct upgrade to Night Runners. They have the same abilities like Vanguard deployment, Stalk, and firing whilst moving, which of course makes them excellent skirmishing units with a nice bump up in damage from Night Runners. This time they also come with Snare Nets, which essentially slow down all enemy units in range, meaning these guys will have a much easier time evading anything that isn't speedy cav. These guys also come in 4 varieties: Regular, Slingers, Poison Regular, and Poison Slingers. The only difference between the non-poison and poison units is that the poison units gain poison attacks. Who would have thunk it? Like last time, the Slingers gain more range at the cost of not being able to fire whilst moving, which makes them into more of a backline unit rather than utilising that Vanguard deployment too much. The strategy for using these guys is the same as their respective Night Runner counterparts, so I won't waste your time going over it again. I would say a balance of 3 regular and 3 slingers will be a good way to ensure your lines are balanced and that you always have some damage coming in if one gets caught out of position. If you can take poison, then it's of course worth doing, because you all know how I feel about my poison damage. Spoilers, I like it a lot. Rattling Guns are up next, and these guys are just the greatest. They're basically what would happen if you gave a giant rat a minigun and replaced the bullets with little pieces of warpstone. Needless to say, they're amazing. These guys fire a fire hose of armor-piercing missiles at the enemy with a bonus versus infantry, so basically any infantry unit in the game will not make it to your lines if they can get some shots on them. They also have the added bonus of anything that's getting shot by them receives a suppressed status effect, meaning they have their speed reduced, meaning these guys stay under the fire hose for that much longer. The only real downside I can think of for these guys is that they don't have the best range, although if they did, they'd be seriously broken, and they're also useless in melee, but it's not like it matters when they can attack from range like they do. They do, however, need an angle to get these shots, so must be ahead of your melee lines to have the maximum effectiveness. As if they couldn't get any better, they also can be upgraded by Clan Scry's Forbidden Workshop, and one of the upgrades makes their ammo regenerate, which is beyond broken. I would say you absolutely need to take these guys into the endgame with you, otherwise you're putting yourself at a huge disadvantage, so do yourself a favour and take 3. The only reason I won't take 6 is because I like to have a bit more range, but if that's not something that bothers you, then go right ahead. From one unit I love to another unit I also love. The Warplock Giselles are next, and by god, they're also outstanding. They have some of the best range of any ranged infantry in the game, and their shots are insanely accurate and do some pretty tasty damage too. The armor-piercing missiles they fire are great for taking out enemy characters, or doing some great damage to approaching cav or other large units. They can also be used against infantry, but they actually do so much damage it's almost a waste making them waste their ammo on units that will die from less. They also have shields for some reason, so are that much more resistant to enemy ranged fire, but in melee they are essentially useless, so you need to make sure you keep them protected there. They also need to get a clear angle on enemy units, so must be ahead of your units to hit enemies. This combined with their slow speed does put them in some danger, but it can be avoided easily enough with a little micro. I had 3 of these guys in my armies along with the Rattling Guns from as soon as I unlocked them, and I kept them all the way into the endgame, but there's one unit left that could sway you if these guys aren't working for you. Poisonwing Mortars are our final ranged infantry units, and they're kind of in a strange spot. They aren't quite ranged infantry, but they aren't quite artillery, but they can sort of do both jobs. They can fire Poisonwing globes over a massive range, so function as very long range globadiers, which is good. But compared to the damage output and accuracy of Giselles, I never really found a use for them personally. Now since they do explosive damage, they are more fitted to taking out large clumps of infantry, but if I want them to do that, then where would that leave my Rattling Gunners? Plus the downside to the explosive damage is that they have a strong chance of hitting your own units once melee begins, making them even worse compared to Rattling Gunners. Are you seeing my point? While these guys may well be the best unit overall to have in your ranged lines, if you can be bothered, then the 2 units you'd have to replace can do a much better job. Nevertheless, if you did want to take these guys, you could make an argument for a composition of 2 of each of these guys, Giselles and Rattling Gunners, but other than that, I don't really feel like they earn a place in my endgame. Now we come to the monsters of the Skaven army, and we only have a couple of units to get through. First are the Rat Ogres. They're basically huge rats that have had a bunch of experiments done on them, and are now angry at the world. They do armor piercing damage, so are great for going after those tougher targets that enemies might bring, but unfortunately they have no armor themselves, so tend to get overwhelmed quite easily if they're against anything too elite. They are very fast however, so can run away from a tricky situation fairly easily, and aren't going to be caught by anything that isn't cav. They also have Frenzy, so have a little bonus at the beginning of the battle, so be sure to make the most of that before they start to lose confidence. I'd say the best use for these guys is either embedded in your front lines to reduce the amount of hits landing on them, or some sort of pseudo-cav, meaning you use their high speed to get into the enemy backlines and either take out their ranged units or sandwich the melee lines. If I'm bringing these guys, then I'd say 2 is plenty, and I only really keep them for a little while, if at all, since there's another unit that I think can fill a similar role much better. The Hell Pit Abomination is honestly one of the most disgusting units I've ever had the displeasure of seeing, but by God, it does put in work. It's quite like the Rat Ogres in the sense that it has a huge amount of armor piercing damage while having very little armor. Unlike them however, it does have a huge HP pool and regeneration, so even if it does take a bunch of damage, it's just going to get the majority of it back anyway. It also causes terror because, obviously, in battle you can really send it against anything, but I found it was best used in huge clumps of infantry units as they can do nothing to avoid its huge AoE attacks, but of course it's worth keeping other units nearby in case it starts to get overwhelmed. It can go toe-to-toe with most other huge units in the game, but in my testing it isn't the strongest as it can get beaten by a single Carnosaur. If it does get into a duel, then be sure to send in some other units to support them and turn the tide a little bit more in your favour. To top it off, this thing is also too horrible to die, meaning that when it is on the brink of death, it will either get a huge boost of HP to keep it alive a little bit longer, or it will die and release a pack of Skaven Slaves, which will then fight for you. I of course take these guys with me into the endgame, but only one of 2 of them at most, since they aren't really the most versatile of units. Next up we come to the War Machines, and first we have the Doomflayers. If you're wondering what can do the Rat Ogre's job better, you're looking at them. These guys are really something special. They're armoured and do armour piercing anti-infantry damage, so are monsters at taking on even some of the toughest infantry in the game in a one-on-one fight. They're also fairly speedy, though not as fast as most cav, so can be caught out if you don't look after them. In battle they do work essentially the same as cav, as you're constantly flanking around enemy units to get their weaker units in the back lines, before pulling back once they send some more guys over to deal with you. They can also be used to charge into the backs of melee lines, and while they don't have the same impact as cav, they can help break the enemy that much sooner. As I said before, they aren't the best versus cav, so it's probably a good idea to avoid them and any other large units, but aside from that, it's open season. I took 2 of these guys with me from the moment I unlocked them to the moment I replaced them with the next unit. Finally, we come to the Doom Wheel, and it's the crowning accomplishment of the Skaven engineers. Alternatively, it's that wheel thing that General Grievous rides, but I'll let you be the judge of that. This thing is really something to behold. It's armoured and deals out a massive amount of armour-piercing anti-infantry damage, so it's a beast at taking out anything smaller than itself. It also has automatic warp lightning rods on the front and sides, so it's constantly doing bonus damage even if it isn't attacking that unit at the same time. Unlike their little brothers, these guys are actually passable at taking on some mid-tier cav, but of course it's not their greatest use. That is of course as an unstoppable flanking tool that rips the enemy backlines to shreds before coming to finish off anything that's left from the melee lines. I replace my Doomflayers with these guys as soon as I can, and I of course take them into the endgame with me. Finally, we get to the artillery, which as you should all know by now is my favourite category. First up is the Plague Claw Catapult. It fires armour-piercing anti-infantry missiles that do huge impact and explosion damage, and are exceptional at taking out huge chunks of approaching enemy infantry, even if it is super tough. It also applies the contaminated effect to anything it hits, so ensure they're running before long, and it's doubtful they'll be coming back. Of course, since it's artillery, it's got great range, so I'll have no trouble getting lots of shots in from the back lines. Once melee lines clash, it's best to retarget to retreating enemies or the back lines to ensure you don't cause damage to your own units with the powerful explosions. I take 2 of these guys as soon as I unlock them, and they stay with me until the very end, even though they are technically a mid-game unit. Our final unit is the Warp Lightning Cannon, and it does exactly what it says in the tin. It fires armour-piercing anti-large bolts of warp lightning over huge distances with pinpoint accuracy, and it's exceptional at taking out enemy characters and mounted units alike. Their projectiles are incredibly fast and do huge amounts of damage, but they do need a line of sight to get hits in, so units hidden over hills or behind objects will be very hard to hit. They of course have fantastic range and have no trouble firing the first volley of the battle, even if they are on the very backs of your lines. I also take 2 of these guys with me from the moment I unlock them until the very end of the game, and they always put in work. Now we come to the Regiments of Renown. I'll call out each unit, what they're a unit of, and the differences they have to the regular units of the same rank. Clan Vulcan Tail Slashers are clan rats with shields, and they gain weapon strength, fire attacks, and 70% fire resistance. Ixcha's Triads are an Eshin Triads unit, and gain the Doppelganger ability. Visktrin's Death Squad are a Death Runners unit, and gain the Duck and Weave ability. Blightscrab's Death Squad are a Plague Monk Censer Bearers unit, and gain the Demagogue ability. Council Guard are a Storm Vermin Halberds unit, and gain Unbreakable. Teeth Breakers are a Rattling Guns unit, and actually lose some missile resistance and gain Concealment Bombs. Natty Bubbo Sharpshooters are a Warplock Jezzail's unit, and lose some missile damage while gaining Snipe and Stalk. The Avalanche Mortars are a Poisonwing Mortars unit, and lose their damage over time in exchange for a huge amount of missile damage. Ikit Zap Zap is a Warp Lightning Cannon unit, and gains some missile damage and the zap effect on its missiles. Dwarf Thing Menace is a Doomflays unit, and loses some melee defense but gains armor sundering attacks and causes fear. Wheels of Doom is a Doomwheel unit, and gains a bunch of missile damage. The next line of units are only accessible through the use of the Forbidden Workshop. The Doombringers are a Warp Fire Throwers unit, and gain health, melee attack and defense, charge defense versus large, and Unbreakable, while losing some leadership and the Scurry Away ability. Death Dealers are a Rattling Guns unit, and gain ammo, range, and missile damage. Eye Takers are a Warplock Jezzail's unit, and lose some missile damage in exchange for blinding shots and the Hawkish Precision ability. Black Hole Flayers are a Doomflays unit, and lose some melee defense in exchange for gaining the ability to cause fear and use of the Brass Orb ability. Finally, Warpfire's Wheel is a Doomwheel unit, and gains health, missile damage, and regeneration. Now we come to my ideal balanced composition for the endgame. This is what I personally had in every army in the end of my campaign to make sure I can go against anything the game throws at me. For my melee line, I had 2 Storm Vermin with Halberds and 4 Plague Monk Censer Bearers. The Storm Vermin go on the outside to ensure any cav flanks can be shut down. For my ranged infantry, I had 3 Warplock Jezzails and 3 Rattling Guns in an alternating pattern, and they actually deploy ahead of my melee lines so they can get plenty of shots off from the get-go. I have 2 Wheels to do some flanking to take out any ranged units the enemy might bring, or just to chase off some retreating units for good. I have 1 Hellpit Abomination to send into melee if anything manages to get through my ranged barrages. I have 2 Plague Claw Catapults and 2 Warpstone Cannons in my furthest back line, and they target approaching infantry and large targets respectively. Finally, I have a single Warlock Master Lord on his Doomwheel if possible, and with all his spells for maximum impact, though all you really need is Warp Lightning. To see how this performs in battle, I'll pass you over to Live Miles. Take it away.
Thanks, Miles. Okay, we're just going to get straight into this now. I have actually made some slight differences to my formation since you last saw. I moved my melee lines up because I was finding my testing that the melee lines were getting shot to pieces by the Empire artillery. I mean, I know the Empire are ridiculously broken right now, but come on, that's a little ridiculous. So I've actually moved my guys up. I'm also moving up my Rattling Guns, my Hellpit Abomination, and my Lord, and soon to be my Doomwheels, which is going to speed this up. Jezzails are moving slightly up just so they can get into range. I have my artillery targeting, key targets, so we have the anti-infantry guys getting the great swords, and then the anti-large getting this Luminash of Hike, and also targeting this Empire Captain here, because he's on a mount, and we want to make the most of that bonus. Okay, we need to slow down a bit. Okay, so all just kind of happened a little bit fast there. What basically happened is they kind of moved their cavalry around in kind of a pincer formation, so I have my Storm Vermin kind of holding them off on both sides, and I have targeted some Rattling Guns and some Jezzails on these units just to get rid of them as quickly as possible. The Empire Captain make a little bit of a charge there. We have the Hellpit Abomination moving in to help this flank, and I believe I'm going to move the Doomwheels up shortly. I believe the Empire Captain actually charges my Lord, which is very unfortunate, but we do actually manage to get a Warp Lightning off, which of course does some serious work because Warp Lightning is broken. Something unfortunate that does happen in this battle, my Lord gets sniped by the 2 Luminax of Heish, which is kind of a shame, but well, I would have liked to get a few more spells off him, but it doesn't matter. The Empire Captain there, again, absolutely destroyed by the Rattling Guns, the Jezzails, and of course my Lord. Here we see the Doomwheels moving up, as I said, to help out on these flanks. Rattling Guns shooting these guys off, making sure they don't come back. Excellent work. Rattling Guns always put in work. They didn't do amazingly in this battle, but as you'll see my campaign playthrough, they can put in serious amounts of work if you let them. We have a little bit of routing here, which is just something that happens when you play as the Skaven. They just constantly rout their cowardly custards, but they generally come back a lot of times. Like you can have them retreat many times and they will come back like 4 or 5 times sometimes. It's ridiculous. There we are. My lord just got sniped by the Luminarch of Hysh. I tried to get one more spell off, but no. He gets charged by these Demigryph Knights here, and unfortunately he does pass. But not to worry, the rest of our guys, they're pretty confident. Apart from these Rattling Guns in the middle there, they also got charged by the Demigryphs. This is where it also kind of started going a little bit wrong, but I mean, that's just what the Skaven are, you know. It all goes a little bit wrong. You just kind of have to adapt and overcome. Unfortunately for these guys, they did charge, and as my Rattling Guns started to retreat and they broke, my Jezzails here got some excellent shots on them, so it was kind of unfortunate because those guys lost like half of their health in that charge. Here we see a lot of units rallying, the Hell Pit Abomination, and we actually have a Doom Wheel that's over here chasing. I should have microed them a little bit better, but not to worry, I do actually catch them eventually. Here we have these guys, we have Rattling Guns and Storm Vermin desperately trying to hold these guys off so I can get some shots in. As you can see, I'm targeting my Plague Claws on these approaching Greatsword units over here, and also my Jezzails are also getting targeted onto the approaching cavalry units, just because, you know, we might as well get them attacking some large targets, just so the damage isn't being wasted, as I said, in their unit profile. Another unit of Plague Monk Sensor Bearers rallying, and I will shortly be bringing them back into this flank to try and help out with these great swords, and these Rattling Guns should rally pretty soon as they go over here as well, and I'll be targeting them on these guys and on these guys to get rid of them. There we are, the Rattling Guns just rallied. Jezzail's putting in some serious work, sniping out these great swords as the Sensor Bearers desperately tried to hold the line. We have another unit of Jezzails here sniping their lord, which is just a standard general of the Empire, and he's quickly going to take quite severe amounts of damage. We also have these Rattling Guns that have just rallied, and they're also going to be targeting this lord, as well as some of these Warp Cannons, so this guy is not going to be around for very long, even though he's fighting some insanely weak melee troops. There we see our Sensor Bearers finally broke with 14 health, 614 health left, and the Jezzails and the Rattling Guns and these Sensor Bearers will quickly clean up these great swords. It all kind of starts to work for us here. We're actually moving up this Doom Wheel back. I kind of realised eventually that he's just kind of sat out here, and the enemy starts to try and snipe me with the Luminarch. There we go, I've just realised they do actually get shot off, which is very unfortunate because it does a ridiculous amount of damage. Those things are stupidly strong against single entity units. And I just start to charge him in, and I'm going to eventually attack those pistols. This one has worked its way around and is attacking these pistoliers, and my Hell Pit Abomination is just kind of in the middle fighting these Caribou Greatswords, which are unbreakable, so that's why they aren't running in desperate fear. Now we see the Jezzails actually broke, but the Empire is just, the Empire Captain is just so low on health, and the rest of the army is broken. And there we go, army losses. The only thing left is these Unbreakable Swordsmen, and we'll quickly clean them up. As I say, I'm not the best at battles, and this was a particularly messy battle, and it took me quite a few attempts to actually work out my proper strategy. But hey, I got the victory. This army I found worked excellent for me in the campaign playthrough, as you will see. So I'm very confident in its ability, in the campaign especially. Let's just quickly go over this and get to the stats. As you can see, the Lord got 38 kills, mostly off that single use of Warp Lightning, and unfortunately he did die in this battle, which is, I mean, it's not the best. But we were against 2 Luminarchs of Hysh, so that's just kind of what happens. As you can see here, the melee lines didn't do amazingly. A couple of Plague Monk units here got plenty of kills, but other than that, they are just basically holding the line so that the rest of these guys can do the work. This Jezzail's unit, this one, really put in so much work, and then the 2 Rattling Guns actually hung around, also got about 70 kills apiece. The artillery units always doing lots of work, of course. Hell Pit Abomination didn't do too much, but he was kind of utilised a little bit late by me. He also got sent against some cavalry, which isn't his specialty. But yeah, we got the victory. They lost 400 more than us, and we're also the Skaven, and you know, we're kind of the numbers. So I think if we make them lose more than us, then that's a pretty good victory if you ask me. Okay, back to you, Miles.
Thanks, Miles. That concludes this section of the guide on the Skaven armies. Next time we'll cover the Lords and Heroes and what they can do for you both in campaign and on the battlefield. Thanks for watching this section of my Skaven guide. If you want to check out the other parts, there's a link in the card and in the description for a playlist to the series. Don't forget to vote in the poll for the next race you want me to make a guide for, which is linked in the description and the comments. If you enjoyed this video at any point, then please do consider leaving a like, as it really does help out a lot. And if you want to see more of this type of video, maybe click that subscribe button so you stay up to date. After all, it is free. For now though, I was COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I'll see you next turn.